Hi, I'm George with NS345. Welcome to the Gain Staging Masterclass video number 2. In video number 1, I introduced the concept of gain staging in layman's terms. In this video, I'm going to give you 5 reasons as to why it is important to understand gain staging. If you don't understand gain staging, going into your DAW to start pulling down faders, adjusting the clip gain is pretty useless. We first need to understand it. Once we understand gain staging, then we can comfortably go into any DAW and carry this process out. The reason why you're asking about gain staging is because you probably went into some forum and you were giving a response like, lower all of your tracks and your master fader by 5 dBFS, and they told you that that would reduce your output level. Well, while that answer is relatively correct, the damage has already been done. And I'll develop this as we continue to talk. To understand what I've just said, let's go back to the beginning. Why is gain staging important? Reason number 1 that I think you need to know. Gain staging is important because it helps you to avoid audio clipping and distortion. Now, I'm not talking about the pretty distortion you get from a guitar pedal. I'm talking about ugly distortion, harsh distortion. If your input signal is driven too hot into your preamp, you're going to get noticeable audio clipping, which may cause weird sounds, also known as artifacts. Again, if you drive your input too hot into your preamp, you may get noticeable sounds, weird sounds, clicks, pops, and things like that, also known as artifacts. You don't want this because it's very difficult to clean it up in the mix, and oftentimes the audio that was recorded becomes useless. I will say that sometimes distortion can be your friend when used on purpose. Oftentimes we like to use distortion to make a vocal cut through the mix, or even a bass that was recorded to help it cut through the mix. Especially on basses, it's really difficult to get a bass to sit well within the mix when there's not enough top end or enough distortion or parallel distortion with that bass track to allow it to cut through the mix. So yes, in that case, distortion can be our friend. In the case of audio clipping and distortion, this is audio clipping and distortion that we're trying to avoid. The second reason why gain staging is so important is because your preamps and your converters have a sweet spot where they like to be touched. And I'll develop this topic in a little bit more detail in later videos, where I'm going to talk about the appropriate levels to use when recording into your DAW. It is important to understand the limitations of your preamps, and it is important to understand the limitations of your converters. It's not as simple as just plugging in and start recording. There's a lot more that's involved, and this is where the professionals separate themselves from the amateurs. A third reason why I think gain staging is important is because your preamps or your outboard gear may not be calibrated to a similar level as your converters or your audio interface. For example, some preamps, some compressors, some of the audio interfaces out there are calibrated to a level of 0 VU equals minus 18 dBFS RMS. Again, most of the gear out there, preamps, converters, audio interfaces, are calibrated to a input level, a maximum input level of 0 VU equals minus 18 dBFS RMS. So this is important. This is very important. For example, if you have a preamp, something like the ADL 700 from Presonus or even the RC 500, you notice that those have VU meters. Oftentimes you're looking at those VU meters, and those are probably hovering around 0 VU when you're trying to track your vocal or an instrument. But then you look at your DAW and your meters are like way up there, and you're going, well, why aren't my meters, my DAW meters, matching the meters on my preamp? And that's because your converters may not be calibrated to the same level, the same input level that your preamps were calibrated to. And this is something I'll discuss more in detail in a later video. Input and output calibration of your analog gear and your converters or audio interface is very important to understand. I don't want you to think that that's a showstopper, but it is something we just need to be aware of. You can still get great recordings with whatever interface you have just now or any converters that you have just now. Don't worry about it. It's just something that we need to understand. Another example that I can give you is I owned a stereo compressor by Art. It was called the Art Pro VLA2. It was a pretty nice compressor, very entry level, very cheap. It sounded good, and I thought it would add lots of harmonics. I thought it would add a little bit of bottom end to my mixes, and it did. It did quite well as long as I knew how to use it. But the meters on the Art Pro never matched the meters in my DAW. The Art Pro VLA, if you notice, if you own one, or you can look this up, there's a little knob right under the VU meter that's for calibration. So if your DAW meter is not matching that VU meter, you can actually move that around. But it's important that you understand the chain between your preamp, your audio interface, your DAW, your converters. Reason number 4, similar to your analog gear calibration or outboard gear calibration, audio interface calibration, and converter input and output calibration, you have your plugins to worry about. Most of the plugins out there, including Waves, are calibrated to receive an input level of 0 VU equals minus 18 dBFS. This means that when the plugin receives a signal that is at minus 18 dBFS RMS going into your plugin, you're hitting the sweet spot of your plugin. If you're mixing your music and you're using a Waves plugin and your track is too hot and you don't understand the differences of level on your meter and your DAW, the input signal, the pre-fader input signal going into your plugin is going to be affected by that, because you're going to have to tweak more EQ, you're going to have to tweak a lot more parameters to get that sound that you're after. When your input signal is going into your plugin at a nominal level of minus 18 dBFS RMS, then you get a great sounding track. It's easier to equalize and it's easier to hear what the plugin is doing. Try that for yourself. Try and gain stage a track and put it in at a hotter signal and at a softer signal, and you would see what I'm talking about. Some later videos, I'm going to show you how I do it in Pro Tools or Studio One or in Logic. Now, don't get all excited about that, because the purpose of this mini-series is not to show you how I do it or to show you how you should do it, but it should be to help you understand how gain staging works so that you can go and do it for yourself without anyone showing you. The 5th reason why I think gain staging is important is because gain staging directly affects the final level of your mix, the output level of your mix. The 5th reason why I think understanding gain staging is important is because it directly affects the sum level of your mix, or the final mix down, the final output of your mix. If you don't understand gain staging, then you don't understand what it is that you need to do to your mix to ensure that you have sufficient room at the end of your mix. Now, I think that this is probably the key thing that we need to understand within the concept of gain staging. It doesn't matter if you balance your tracks right, or if you even gain stage them right, if you don't understand how gain staging affects the final mix. That's why we do all this work, because we want the final mix to have sufficient headroom to be loud, to feel loud, and to understand where the peaks need to be within the concept of your mix. If you're listening to this, this should be your focus. What do I need to do to get a nice output level on my mix? If you start to balance all of your tracks, if you start to adjust the gain staging on all of your tracks to where you're hitting the sweet spot of your plugins, you're hitting the sweet spot of your analog gear, your converters, the final output, the final mix down is going to be so much fun. It's going to feel good, and you're really going to get into enjoying the sweet sound that's produced by accomplishing appropriate gain staging levels. So I hope you find this video helpful. These 5 reasons have helped me so much, and maybe even write them down and keep them with you on your desk or your production desk so that you can always refer back to them. Remember that what we're talking about here is gain staging in the concept of mixing, recording, and mastering. This mini-series is aimed at beginners, so I hope that you're learning a lot. I'm having fun talking about this, and it's helping me to grow, to analyze gain staging a little bit better, and to ensure that I'm double checking what I'm telling you because I'm sure some of you out there would say, well, that's not right, or that's wrong, and that's okay. Let me know if I've said something wrong and you think I could fix it so I could correct it on the next video. Hopefully, I'll catch those comments by then. Thanks again for watching. I'm George with NS345, and I hope that you're having a great week.